The world is a battlefield. Germany has invaded Poland. Britain and France retaliate, declaring war against the Nazis. Halfway around the globe, another brutal conflict is also underway. China is under attack from Japan's Imperial Army, facing the onslaught alone since 1937, making them the first country to have entered World War II. A war of resistance that spanned 8 long years and cost more than 14 million lives. This was the longest theater of the Second World War. My name is Rana Mitter, Oxford professor and a historian of modern China. I've spent years researching and writing about China's World War II. I'm traveling across the country to find the last remaining survivors. Gathering first-hand accounts. To reveal the true stories of China's struggle to survive. And how victory helped forge modern China. The sound of rebuilding here in the old square of Warsaw. And it might be hard to believe, but 90% of this picturesque scene has been painstakingly reconstructed since the end of the war that saw Germany invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Most of this capital city was reduced to rubble. And this, of course, was the place where World War II broke out in Europe. Between 1939 and 1945, some 5.5 million Poles would lose their lives. Some 300 kilometers from Warsaw, on the outskirts of Oświęcim, is a stark reminder of the Holocaust. Auschwitz-Birkenau, concentration and extermination camp. Stretching over 174 hectares, this is the largest murder site in a single location in the history of humanity. There's something particularly poignant about seeing something as ordinary as a shoe in a place that's as out of the ordinary, as sinister as this. Belongings of the dead. These everyday objects bring to mind the scale of the killings that took place here in Auschwitz. In order to restore relations with countries that have been plundered by the Nazis, the West German government made a public mea culpa. Billions were paid to survivors and to the families of victims in an effort to try and create some sort of restitution. One of the worst incidents of Nazi barbarism took place here, in Warsaw's Wola district. Known as the Wola massacre, in August 1944, the occupiers committed mass murders, rape, robbery, destruction and arson in order to crush the Poles' spirit to fight during the Warsaw Uprising. Wola was burnt to the ground, with an estimated 40,000 residents murdered. Little known to the world at the time, A massacre similar to the one in Wola had already occurred on the other side of the world in Nanjing, China, on an even bigger scale. On December the 13th, 1937, the Japanese entered the city of Nanjing, the old nationalist capital. Capturing the city would be a form of symbolic victory over the Chinese. The Japanese overran the city within hours, and over the next 6 weeks, committed some of the worst atrocities the world had ever seen. Mass executions, extreme cruelty, looting and rape. Nobody stood a chance. Although historians are still disputing the exact numbers, some 20 to 40,000 women were raped. Official Chinese statistics go as high as 300,000 killed, soldiers and civilians. And yet there are some who say that this massacre never took place. The testimonies of the survivors provide crucial information on what happened in those 6 long weeks. "70 years on, I'm hoping to find one of the few remaining survivors who's able to shed light on what happened." 85-year-old Nanjing resident Xia Shuqin is a mother of 2, but she prefers to live alone. She's agreed to share her story of the massacre with me. Could you tell us what happened to you on the 13th of December of 1937?
当年我在1937年的时候，我才8岁。我一家人呢就是9口人。但是我母亲和我邻居妈妈还躲在桌子底下。所以这样的情况之下呢，还被他活活打死了，一个拽在外头，但另一个就睡在桌子里头。但是我的身上那个血流满身。 戳了3刀以后，这个是1刀，这个地方1刀，然后这个后头还有1刀，血流的满身，这个手上滴的都是血。当时我醒过来的时候非常疼，但是我就和我的妹妹就在这4人屋里头，就躲在这个桌子底下。 白天也不敢吃，害怕不敢出来。到了晚上，快天不黑的时候了，才出来拿点锅巴，弄点水。
There was a safety zone set up by Americans and Germans living in Nanjing at that time. Did that safety zone help you?
到6个星期。 但是后来我舅舅就把我们姊妹2个人一同到了这个安营区。你要报告，你才有的吃；你不报告，你去的人没得吃。那时候人太多了，一个人挖一窑子煮，一个人舀一窑子煮。当时这么多的情景呢，但是我想给它忘掉，可是我自己忘不掉。
The safety zone was key to Xia and her sister's survival as the slaughter in Nanjing continued. Approximately the size of New York's Central Park, it consisted of more than 20 refugee camps. Formed by an international committee in the heart of Nanjing, it was headed by German businessman John Rabe to protect the Chinese from the invading Japanese army. And although the house we have here is now a museum, you still have this feel of a luxurious but rather intimate place. imagining some 500 or 600 people jammed into this space as they were during the first days of the Japanese invasion. Those who managed to find salvation or escape from the city in time were considered the lucky ones. But for those left behind in Nanjing, the horrors of war were about to reach new heights. Nanjing, one of the 4 great ancient capitals of China. With an urban population of over 7 million, the city is the second largest commercial center in the East China region after Shanghai. And today, there's renewed interest in Nanjing's history. Occupying around 28,000 square meters, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall was constructed in 1985 to commemorate the fallen. The site itself is built on a mass grave of some 10,000 corpses. 3 different groups of Japanese soldiers led the assault on Nanjing. Once the onslaught had begun, the Japanese conquered quickly, and the Chinese defense was crushed. But affected by battle weariness and enraged by Chinese resistance, the occupiers made Nanjing pay the price in blood. The city offered nowhere to run or hide. Even the remote Zijin Hills at the edge of the city were not safe. It's said that a notorious killing competition was held there by the Imperial Army, supposedly to help desensitize the troops. Reports stated that Second Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Takeshi Noda were competing to see who would be the first to kill 100 Chinese. Mukai scored 106, Noda 105. But unable to determine who passed the 100 mark first, they extended the goal by 50. This was one of many brutal acts unleashed on Nanjing. And this violent history became part of the city's identity. But what was it that made Japan go on this rampage to control China? In Europe, before World War II, Hitler and the Nazi regime claimed the need for expansion. At the same time, the Japanese increased their presence on the Chinese mainland, demanding new markets and new resources to cope with the pressures of a growing population and a burgeoning economy. And with these new designs for expansion, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. But it wasn't enough, and Japan's growing imperial ambitions led to a full-scale invasion. I'm en route to Beijing, where it all began. To that one single incident that neither the Japanese nor the Chinese were truly prepared for. Inside the old Wanping fortress is Marco Polo Bridge. Built in 1189, it was the only gateway into Beijing at the time. Revered as a work of art by the great traveler Marco Polo, the bridge represents something different for the Chinese: misery. This was the place where the war first broke out in July 1937. And there's someone who knows the real story. 你好，你是郭老师吗？欢迎欢迎欢迎。Guo Jingxing, former curator of the Marco Polo Bridge Museum, recorded many testimonies from battle veterans and their surviving relatives, including Ji Xingwen, who was on site that fateful night. Around 2200 hours, Japanese troops begin an unannounced training exercise. When the exercise is over, they perform a roll call. One soldier, Private Shimura Kikujiro, is missing. The Japanese demand entry into Wanping to search for their missing soldier. Regiment Chief Ji Xingwen of the 29th Army declines the request. He wants his own troops to perform the search. The Japanese issue an ultimatum with artillery already pointed at the Chinese. ready for bloodshed. This story remains forever in Guo's memory. Nowadays, he pays homage to China's World War II by making the official anniversary seals. He too was a survivor.
在日本侵华以前，77事变以前呢，我是北方的一个标准的农民的孩子，父亲母亲都是种地，我们当时那时候是一家3口人，生活挺好。
What do you remember about the month of July 1937, the month that the Marco Polo Bridge incident broke out?
77事变那个时候啊，我是9岁，我是28年生人嘛。有一天呢，这个下午，忽然间啊，从我们这个天空里头就飞过好的一大片飞机。我们始终没见过飞机。 那是第一次见的飞机的，直到飞机一过去，大家很奇怪，就知道这不是中国飞机，这是日本飞机，大家就议论说这不是好事儿。他就呢从芦台到着那个济运河，济运河就在我们村边，一到下午2点钟左右，我们就呢看到有10、20来辆啊小舰艇，日本的小舰艇就过来了。 5点钟就听到炮响，都打起来了。到第4天，打完了第4天，那个死尸就从河里流过来了。开始啊，7、8个麻袋装着死尸，一个麻袋装一个死尸，7、8个麻袋，这一大排就过，1排、2排、3排这么过了4、5排。 天天过，整过了1个月。
The endless bodies floating down the river were like a foreboding of the full-scale war that would begin here. What was the motivation for this attack? Japan's imperial ambitions were growing, and China was the natural place for it to expand on the mainland. After all, they had occupied Manchuria in the northeast since 1931. Now, Japan planned to conquer the entire country within just 3 months. Their strategy was to cut off China from Beijing in the north through to the south, in order to gain control over the more fertile and prosperous eastern parts of China. Challenging Japan would be a highly risky venture, but it was inevitable. This is the time for the determination to fight. This is the turning point for existence or obliteration. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek would make a fateful decision, even if it meant putting the lives of his countrymen at risk for the sake of China's survival. But China's political scene at that time was largely divided. According to documents, in July of 1937, Chiang Kai-shek sought unification of the regional leaders across China, together with the communist leader Mao Zedong. Both agreed that China had come to a crisis point, and that war was the only chance of coming through it. Putting aside their revolutionary dreams for now, the Chinese Communist Party pledged to make their own forces, the Red Army, part of the nationalist military, known as the 8th Route Army. The Communists, or CCP's guerrilla forces south of the Yangtze River, would also be recruited and renamed the New 4th Army. From their resistance base areas, including Jinchaji, the Communists mobilized a critical mass of locals to fight guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. The Japanese invasion forced the government to centralize authority, addressing one of the major problems of the era, warlordism, the fact that different military leaders controlled different parts of China. The two major parties came together in an uneasy alliance. There were real differences between the communists and the nationalists, but they were united in the belief that China was locked into a struggle for its very existence.
Japs have been accomplished. This too they got away with. China had become a nation. River. It is the
As the Japanese moved south, Shanghai, the financial capital of China, was next. But this time, the Chinese were convinced they could fight for the city until the bitter end. 1937. Japan is on a rampage through China, and Shanghai is next. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Red Army have joined forces as a last attempt to save China from total annihilation. The plan was to prevent Japan from moving south and to bring the war into the international spotlight. China desperately needed allies, and Chiang hoped this might encourage the British and the Americans to take part. Like the troops at the time, I'm off to Shanghai. I'm hoping to meet the last remaining survivors and learn from them the importance of the battle and why it was so very crucial. July 1937. Japan had managed to secure Manchuria, the northeast of China, along with Beijing and Tianjin. The Japanese Imperial Army began marching along the major railways, cutting through central China via Shanghai. Today, the city of Shanghai serves as one of the most important commercial, financial, and industrial centers of China, not to mention a hub for strong relations with the international community. This was already clear in 1937, 2 years before the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, which for the wider world is the beginning of the Second World War. Shanghai, China's most modern city, came under attack. Along Shanghai's iconic Bund stands the Peace Hotel, which is made up of the former Cathay Hotel and the adjacent Palace Hotel. These two buildings are divided by Nanjing Road, one of the busiest shopping streets in Shanghai. This spot right here was the scene of one of the first events of the Battle for Shanghai and one of the most tragic. Some 1,000 people who were present here that day perished. But I was lucky enough to locate one of the few survivors. Ni hao, ni hao, 我是 Mida. At 94 years old, Wang Zhong's memory is crystal clear. Then just a teenager, he volunteered as a soldier in 1937. After 3 months of training, Wang was sent straight to the front lines as Shanghai prepared for battle.
抗战打仗，我17岁，我是一个店员。上海打仗呢，那么我店里派人去参加这个民众的组织武装。
August the 14th, 1937, was a day that a terrible, terrible incident happened. Do you remember anything about that day?
8月14号那一天，中国飞机到黄浦江去炸那个翠云看，还有在长门看2个兵看。那个翠云看呢，它上面的高炮啊，把这个飞机啊打伤了，打伤了这个飞机啊，就出了平衡了。中国驾驶想把这个炸弹呢摔掉飞机轻一点，飞到杭州去。那么这里上海到杭州有200多公里啊，它这个炸弹呢想摔到那个泡沫厅，泡沫厅很大空场，它摔在里面，伤亡就少了，它慌了，还没到那里它就摔了，正好离开300公尺。到下来了，正好是大世界这个南面区的附近。这个大世界当时的抗战的这个主角啊，这个四郊的农民啊，都到中间的来，这个人啊多得不得了，那么死亡的人不少。
A A tragedy that drove home the point that amidst the chaos of war, a single misstep can lead to a deadly outcome. China simply wasn't equipped to fight to the same degree as the Japanese. So how did the Chinese army manage to hold out for a 3-month period?
中国军队的思想，官兵一致，寸土不让，坚持抗战，所以取得这个3个月的时间。
Wang lives in Shanghai to this day. He's still trying to find his peace with the past. In Shanghai, one final battle would be fought in full view of the Western community. And it was to take place at a strategic location across from the international settlement.
British.
Home to the British and the Americans, whom the Japanese wanted to keep out of the war.
These detachments were limited in...
A group of 800 men were tasked with defending Sihang warehouse on the front lines from thousands of Japanese to allow the withdrawal of the remaining Chinese troops from Shanghai from behind the line of defense. Xie Jimin is the son of Xie Jinyuan, the commander of the 800-strong regiment. With renewed interest in China's history, the warehouse is being restored and under renovation.
后面那个仓库呢是4个银行，后来我们父亲率领800壮士守这个4行仓库，就有个有利的条件。他呢背靠租界，那么北面跟西面敌人可以进攻，东面跟南面敌人不能进攻。再加上这个仓库呢非常坚固，底楼就是东西两面有2个大门，北面有2个大门，就是底楼是4个大门。他把这个4个大门呢全部关闭，关闭以后就用那个沙包和仓库里面的粮食，把那个门全部堵起来。就敌人把门破坏了，我们还能够用沙包把它堵住。然后呢，因为仓库的窗口很大，每一个仓库都有3、4个人这么宽，那么他就命令把那个仓库呢堵掉一半，关掉一半，也用沙包堵掉一半，留另外一半。每一个窗口留2个战士，就任何情况之下，你这个窗口不能拖人。那么敌人进攻了，听我父亲的命令。然后呢，就是一起射击跟投弹，那么这样呢，就把敌人的进攻打退。
Known as the 800-strong regiment, it was later revealed that there were actually only around 400 men. Commander Xie had lied in order to throw off the enemy.
后来我父亲说，这里不是师部，也不是旅部，也不是4行仓库，这是我们400多人的坟墓。我谢晋元绝对不会抛下你们，自己偷偷的跑掉。我要和你们400多人在一起，在这个最后的阵地上坚守在这里，牺牲在这里。
Xie's legacy lives on as his son continues with efforts to honor his memory. But at that time, after 3 months of war, the Chinese had lost and were forced to retreat inland. However, they succeeded in cutting off Japan from advancing south. But there would be another surprise. The Soviet Union offered military assistance, including pilots, for China. If Japan had occupied China, it would have been a natural launch pad for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So it was natural for Joseph Stalin to offer assistance. But it wasn't enough. The international assistance that Chiang craved never arrived, and China would fight essentially alone.
Bombed and burning buildings.
Neither the Japanese nor the international community expected China to take such a determined stand. The Battle of Shanghai represented a moment where China would no longer take things lying down and allow Japan to swallow its territories piece by piece without a fight. (1937). World War II begins unexpectedly for China. A skirmish at Marco Polo Bridge quickly escalates into a full-scale war against the Japanese Imperial Army. The country's leaders vow to resist, no matter how great the sacrifice. By the end of 1937, the capital, Nanjing, had fallen and forced the Chinese central government to move westward to Chongqing. The Japanese Imperial Army were also on the move. They wanted to take over Suzhou and continue their plans to occupy China. To achieve this, they first had to get through Taierzhuang. Li Jingshan volunteers his time as a tour guide in Taierzhuang's ancient town, sharing the history of his town and his people.
这个墙壁上这些大痕迹都是那时候战争时候留下来的。
The town suffered unimaginable destruction, and this 82-year-old witnessed most of it. I can see that Taierzhuang still bears the wounds of its war-torn past. Even Li's house wasn't spared. What was the atmosphere like in the days leading up to the Battle of Taierzhuang? Were people panicked? Were they prepared? Did they know what was going to come?
战前，在老百姓来说呢，他不知道什么是个战争，他没有这个战争这个词儿，他只能说是打仗。 那飞机，小孩先发现，小孩就发风筝，他都不是一点乱喊风筝吗？哎，包括老年人，他也不知道，敢说这不是风筝，这是飞机，他们不知道。哎，飞机以后医疗炸弹了，哟，那飞机还这样的，就那时候才开始害怕。
What happened to your family when they left Taierzhuang and had to flee?
逃难时候呢，当时呢，虽然不知道什么，那呢，我坐在这个车上，因为这上这边还装着东西，我在上提这个柳树枝子，你。 车那是喷泥糊，搁水能吹响，吹哨，当哨子吹。那时候很乐观，不想走，哎，走都说一步走一步回头看一看，走一步回，那就是那种情况，不想离开这个家。
And when you and your family did finally come back to Taierzhuang, what did it look like? What do you remember seeing?
这个地当时看那个情况呢。 悄悄是地面是黑色的，你把太阳现在晴天是黑色的，等下雨一冲发，它就显现出来了，就是红色的。那从那以后不来玩了，从那以后都不来了。这还确确实实这场战争打在这儿打的相当激烈。
Listening to Li Jingshan's stories reminded me that if you're a general, if you're a politician, war may seem very planned, very strategic. But for ordinary people, it's chaos, it's violence, it's instability. And the ripples from that can last for decades. Taierzhuang was a strategic location. Not only was it along the Grand Canal, China's major north-south waterway, but it also had a railway line that bypassed Xuzhou. It became Japan's next target. If the Japanese wanted to maintain their hold on Beijing and Nanjing and go on to Wuhan, then they had to control the vital railway junction of Xuzhou, starting with the nearby town of Taierzhuang. The city structure gave the Chinese an unusual advantage. Instead of a sophisticated battle, they turned to hand-to-hand combat in the narrow lanes. But the Imperial Army underestimated the force of the Chinese and weren't able to sustain the fight. When I was researching this battle, I read reports of a crack military squadron that ran night raids against the Japanese. They used really primitive weapons, even tying bombs to their own bodies. But what sort of men would put themselves forward for such a dangerous task? A group of men known as the Expendables infiltrated various parts of China. Shi Fengcheng was the commander of the 57-man suicide squad in Taierzhuang. But their efforts seem to have faded from the pages of history. Ren Shigan, a retired teacher, has been studying battle archives and interviewing veterans to map the course of the battle that took place here. What was the significance of the Expendables during the Battle of Taierzhuang? What was their role?
敢死队在这里，那就有赤峰城市的那一些将士们，就给敌人又来了一场很大的拼杀。这100多人，就还剩57人。在这种危急的时候，这57人呢，就又组成了一个最后的敢死队。那真是大刀向鬼子头上砍去，在这个城内就一阵拼杀，结果把日军打退。
The Expendables used Guandi Temple as their command headquarters. For the Chinese, Guandi is a symbol of loyalty.
赤峰镇把指挥部安在这里，他的手下、他的部下，所有守城的兵，都应该是为国为民族，做到忠义2字，要为保卫国土、守住台儿庄城而献身。
13 men did survive from the Expendables. Are any of them still alive with us today?
我想这些敢死队员们，他们活着都得是接近100岁、100多岁，现在可能没有活着的了。
The sacrifice made by the Expendables is regarded with great respect by those who know what happened. This battle was a rare victory for China. But why was it so rare? Well, at Taierzhuang, the tactics were better, and the troops were successfully resupplied from behind the lines, something that happened all too seldom in other campaigns. But with a bit of help from the Expendables, Taierzhuang was a real morale booster, and it signaled that even if the war was lengthy, China would fight back. By the end of the battle, the town of Taierzhuang was nothing but ruins. However, the victory has been commemorated by the efforts made to restore the town to its former glory. The defeat at Taierzhuang wasn't enough to stop the Japanese from moving towards China's interior.
By their warlords,
Japan had already invested too much to turn back now. But the Chinese would be ready with a defense strategy that would blindside the aggressors and trigger one of the greatest tragedies of World War II. Today, China as a country is a force to reckon with. It's transformed itself and its role in world politics at an unprecedented rate. But 70 years ago, the Japanese army was threatening to end its freedom and murder anyone in their way. China had been fighting a losing battle with Japan for years before war broke out in Europe. In 1938, China enjoyed its first victory at Taierzhuang, but it would be a short-lived triumph. Xuzhou fell soon after. Wuhan was next. How could the Japanese be stopped? Stretching across 5,464 kilometers, the Yellow River is known as China's Mother River. They say that this basin was the cradle of the northern Chinese civilization, and during this country's early history, it was the most prosperous region of China. But the people have a different name for this river, China's sorrow. Liu Haiyong has been studying the course of the Yellow River throughout the history of China's war.
黄河是向东流的，就这一个虚线可以看到这个黄河的走向。这一个蓝色的区域就是黄河向东南造成的这种新河道。当时日军沿着这个陇海铁路一直就是往西要去攻打郑州，计划就是通过占领开封、中牟、郑州之后，然后通过占领郑州去占领武汉。
Japan hoped to end the war once and for all in Wuhan, where the nationalist military headquarters was based. In a desperate attempt to stall any further advance by the Japanese, on June the 9th, 1938, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the dikes along the Yellow River to be breached at Huaiyuankou, near Zhengzhou.
当时做这个决定，从现有的史料来看，它是十分艰难。它不是说一瞬间，也不是说这个一周两周，因为在1935年，他的这个外国的军事顾问都给他提议，要必要的时候可以通过以水带兵啊，通过黄河水造成一个天然的战略屏障，把这个日军的进攻计划和路线都切断。到了1938年，国民政府他们第一战区的这个参谋部也提出这个事儿。 眼看着他这个战场上节节败退，他不得就是没有办法了，所以说才这个壮士当晚痛下决心来实施这一个策略。
The tactic succeeded in stalling the Japanese. By strategically breaking the dikes of the Yellow River wide open, a massive flood of water hurtled towards the areas threatened by Japanese troops.
日本的这个有一支部队，有骑兵，有坦克，有炮兵，等于全部就是说被水淹，当场都死了几百人，还有很多人困于水中被国军士兵去抓住。
Although turning the river into a weapon took out the Japanese army, it proved catastrophic for millions of innocent Chinese civilians. One of the officers in charge of the breaking of those Yellow River dikes recorded in his diary that the flow of the water looked like 10,000 galloping horses. He also wrote that the sight made his heart ache. This was the last line of defense for China's survival, but it demanded the ultimate sacrifice. China will never give up any part of its territories. In the face of aggression, self-defense is the only way. It wasn't an action that was taken lightly, but it led to one of the deadliest acts of environmental warfare in history. Figures issued by the nationalist government in 1948 suggested huge casualties. For the three affected provinces of Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu, at least 800,000 Chinese died from drowning, starvation, or ensuing diseases, with some 4.8 million becoming refugees.
死的死，逃的逃，等于他这一个后续影响特别深远，也为以后的这种灾荒啊埋下了伏笔。
In 1937, after the Battle of Shanghai, vast numbers of Chinese families made the trek westward as part of the mass refugee flight. And this had a tremendous impact on the traditional Chinese family system, dwarfing even the huge numbers of people displaced in Europe at the end of World War II. Some 100 million Chinese became refugees in their own country during those wartime years. And this forced the government into creating a system of relief and rehabilitation to cope with that increasing influx. For despite the cost, China was determined to survive. China managed to survive this war of resistance alone for 4 years. A far cry from the 3 months the Japanese had expected. After the Japanese invasion, many fled west to the temporary wartime capital at Chongqing. These internal displacements helped forge a new sense of national consciousness that would shape China for many decades to come. But Chongqing itself was ill-suited to mass refugee flight. Resources were scarce, and the Japanese stepped up the scale and the intensity of their terror tactics, hoping to bring China to its knees. But then, in 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor opened a new chapter for China. The West finally realized the significance of that country's efforts during the emerging global war. Help was on the way.